Good morning, thank you for joining us today for our webinar Wednesday session for September. Today we are looking at safety at outdoor events. My name is Katie and I'm Digital Services Specialist at CABE, and I'm here to help you this morning with any questions or potential issues that you may have along the way. So what I will invite you to do is get involved. It's an interactive webinar, so on the right hand side of your screen, or maybe at the top depending on how you're viewing the session this morning, there's a little panel where you can actually send in questions to us. So feel free to, any questions that you want to send in as we go, type those in, they'll pop up on our screen, and we'll either deal with your questions as we go along, or maybe we'll group them and raise them at the end. So again, feel free to get in touch. We will have a little poll as well running in this morning's session, so for you just to pop in your tick your answer there, just to again answer some questions for us. Your presenter this morning is Kevin Blunden, our Technical Director, and he'll be talking you through this morning's session. So without further ado, I'll hand over, and Kevin will take you through safety at outdoor events.
Good morning. Welcome to the first webinar of the autumn season after a short break in the summer. Thank you for joining us this morning. Hopefully we're going to cover something that may be relevant to some of you. This is a webinar that was originally scheduled for earlier in the year, and then we held it back to add some additional content just to highlight some issues that may be more relevant in recent times than perhaps they were before. Before we go too far with the webinar though, I really just want to get a feel for you as an audience and understand how it is that you're likely to be involved in an event. So I'm going to ask you to tell me briefly what sort of role you have as within events. Now, what you should see coming up on your screens at the moment, if everything works probably, is a quick little poll for you to tick a box to show how you're going to be involved in an event. And what we can then do is just get a feel for where you are, what you're doing. So that poll should be running at the moment. Let's just see how we're going. I've got votes coming in to say whether you're an organizer or a site operator, as an advisor or as an attendee. So that's working reasonably well. Got about 2/3 of you voted, so I'll keep the poll open for another few seconds just to give you a chance to put anything else on there. But otherwise, if we're just about there with that, I'll close that poll off now. I think most of you have probably voted. And what you should hopefully, if the technology works, and it's always a bit iffy with these things, what you should be seeing now on your screen is the results of the poll, which should show that the bulk of you are as attendees or as safety advisors. A few of you would act as an organizer, and some of you would act as a site operator. So a bit of a mix between us there, which is fine because it just helps me focus on what we look at as we go forward today. Right, so back to the presentation and looking at what we're looking at. And so just to sort of highlight really when an event is underway, where the responsibilities really lie. So the primary duty of care for safety for people attending the event, people working at the event, lies with the organizer of the event and the owner of the venue, which may or may not be the same person or body. And then there's also a general duty of care of anybody who's involved with that event in providing advice or a service to the organizer, or providing any subcontracted services or any elements of what's actually involved within that. And then as we go down the line, down to individuals and promoters of the event, as well as those who might be doing individual concessions or ancillary services. So everybody has a shared level of responsibility, and as such everybody should be aware of safety considerations. What we do look to see to try and address some of these issues is obviously, as well as a duty of care and actually putting measures in place to prevent disorder and to protect safety, there's also a responsibility to have insurance in place just to cover things should the worst occur. Now, the level of cover of insurance, I put a figure in the middle of this slide, but to be perfectly honest, it obviously will vary drastically depending on what the event actually is. And normally when you're organising an event, you won't only want public liability and employers' liability insurance, but you'll also want to have insurance to cover you as an organizer or if anything goes wrong. So in terms of cancellation insurance or damage or property insurance, so that the whole package is covered in the event that something's gone wrong. And quite often the insurer will apply several conditions to the way in which you run the event to mitigate any potential losses that they may have. So the premiums will depend on the advice the insurer gives you and whether or not you take that on board. From a legislative point of view, there's a confusing mass of legislation that will apply to hosting any event, from health and safety at work through to first aid regulations, control of hazardous substances, obviously things like fire precautions, and even for temporary structures and some events, things like the construction design and management regulations. So it's important to have a grasp and understanding of all of these particular issues, because each of them will come with a requirement to do things in a certain way, to carry out risk assessments, to put in certain control measures to make sure that the event maintains its safety and nobody comes to any harm. And so if you're working on a fairly large event, it's going to be absolutely critical that you've got a team who are there to do that from the organizer side, but also from the safety and advisory side, so that somebody can advise on each particular area that's required under legislation, so that we end up with a package that meets everybody's requirements rather than having measures that are put in place to achieve a suitable situation under one piece of legislation conflicting perhaps with something else. So one of the key things in planning an event is to make sure that at an early stage the organizer puts together a management team and a management structure so that it's clear that everybody knows exactly what their role is within the event. And if there are external agencies who are then providing advice, it's important that they are involved at the earliest possible stage so that a communication process can actually be an interactive process, and that any enforcing bodies are involved to advise at an early stage to prevent difficulties occurring later on. It's absolutely critical with any group of individuals organising an event to establish exactly who it is who's in control and who has what responsibility, so that there is a clear line and a chain of command, and that everybody knows the tasks they have to fulfill in the lead up to the event, in the planning, during the event itself, and in the breakdown. And quite often it gets ignored that during the breakdown phase of any event, there is still potentially a risk to health and safety of individuals, and we have to try and make sure that we protect everybody, including site operatives, right up until the end of the event. So realistically, good communication can prevent an awful lot of issues, and therefore we have to try and make sure that we have that communication line in place and everything's sorted out. Now, I understand that some of you this morning are suffering with some sound issues. Katie's usually on top of things like that, and I'm sure she is, just to see if we can improve the signal bandwidth. I've just turned off my webcam, so unfortunately, well, probably fortunately for you, you can't see me anymore, but hopefully that might give us a bit more bandwidth to improve the sound quality. So apologies if you're still having any difficulties. Right, so in managing the event then, what would we have to consider? And if we're talking about a large event, something with over maybe 500 people, then you're going to have more of a management structure. Even smaller events will need a degree of management and control. But when we start establishing maybe what a large event is, we probably talk at 500 people or more. Quite often the organizer, unless they've experience of doing a lot of these sorts of events, will need some sort of advice from a team. That may be internal staff, employees, it may be external consultants, it may be enforcement bodies providing advice into the management structure, but also then management will then have to provide information and advice to everybody involved in elements of the event. For a large event, it will be essential to appoint a safety officer, someone with overall health and safety responsibility. And part of that role would include carrying out risk assessments. Now, that would not only be a safety risk assessment, it would be a fire risk assessment, and then there would be assessments for any other particularly likely eventualities, which in now would unfortunately include an assessment in terms of the likes of potential terrorism and events that might occur to disrupt the event. There are a range of guides produced by the government, jointly usually by the Association of Chief Police Officers and Police Scotland, coming out of the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office to cover protective security advice measures for a range of events. And they deal with large outdoor events, they deal with arena-based events, as well as smaller and high-profile events. So a lot of information there about things like planning, carrying out an assessment, determining what sort of risk factor there is and what measures you put in place to deal with terrorism. And dealing with the terrorism is really a combination of the security at the event and planning for that eventuality and the emergency, which would form part of the emergency plan for the activity. Overarching all of this, it would be essential for an event to start off with a safety policy, a declaration of an intent from the organisers that establish exactly what it is we're trying to achieve. It demonstrates a commitment. It also identifies the key principles that are involved and helps to explain a focus and a driving point for everything that then cascades down from that safety policy. But the policy itself will be more a high-level talking principle document rather than a detailed plan. Where the detailed plan starts to come into effect are things like doing the risk assessments. So if you're planning an event, there's an overall risk assessment for the event. If you've got concessions or stands or stalls or food outlets, they will need to carry out their own risk assessment, which fits within the overarching assessment. And then if there are particular activities going on at the event, which may be the core focus, it may be an outdoor music event, and obviously the stage and the artists are the key activity, or it may well be that there are other entertainment events going on around. All of those activities also need their risk assessment. And realistically, in trying to plan an event, it's desirable to get as much of that information as early into the process as you possibly can. Unfortunately, it tends to be the case that a lot of the smaller activities and the smaller stalls come on board later into the event and therefore have to be accommodated within their overall risk profile. And that can be important because actually, in terms of the overall event planning, actually physically where these things are going to be positioned in relation to services, exits and all the rest of it can be quite critical, and last minute alterations can cause problems. So when we're carrying out the event risk assessment, what we have to do is identify the hazard. Now, a hazard is something which has the potential to cause harm. And in reality, hazards should be identified, and that might relate to harm to the individual. It might be activities, it might be equipment. And then you have to evaluate what is the potential risk. So having identified something that's the potential to cause harm, what is it actually likely to cause and how likely is it to happen? And that, what is the effect and the likelihood is what makes up the risk element. Now, a lot of hazards that are identified may end up with a fairly minimal risk in that either they're highly unlikely to happen, or that actually if they do occur, the potential for causing harm is relatively low. And those negligible risks can almost be ignored in most cases. But however, when we get to a hazard that we then has the potential for a risk, what we tend to do is follow a chain of how we deal with it, which follows the acronym ERIC. So the first thing you possibly do, having identified the hazard, is to establish whether you can actually totally eliminate that particular feature or that activity or whatever it is altogether. Can we remove the risk? Can we replace it with something else that has a lesser potential for harm? So that's the first thing to try and do. If it's not possible to eliminate it altogether, then you have to look at what measures can you put in place to reduce the potential risk from that hazard. And having identified what that's going to do, that then requires a degree of policing to make sure that those measures are put in place and maintained to reduce that risk at all times. And along with that, people then need to be educated and informed on what that is. If it's a lesser risk, the next thing is to provide information. It's to warn people, it's to tell people, it's to physically stop people going to areas, it's signage, it's training of stewards and like, to make sure that the hazard is remote from the people, or people understand the potential risks. And then the final way in which you then look at reducing the potential is by actually putting in control measures. Now, the equivalent to this, if you like, in the construction sector is the providing of personal protective equipment. It's a sort of a last resort, but it's maybe the only way to reduce the level of risk to a suitable level. So the safety plan is going to include huge amounts of information. It's going to identify all the key personnel, and then depending on what the event actually includes, it will cover crowd control, security, medical, first aid, food hygiene, temporary structures. Everything will be covered within the event safety plan, including recorded risk assessments and the plan of what to do in an emergency. And actually having a plan of how you're going to react and how you're going to deal with things, how you're going to communicate, how you're going to guide people safely away if something goes wrong is absolutely critical. So an awful lot of things to take into account, and each of these elements on a particularly large event will obviously have separate individuals maybe leading on them, but for smaller events, one event safety officer may be trying to deal with all of these issues. So when we're looking at our emergency plan, it is a bit of crystal ball gazing. You've got to try and establish exactly what might go wrong and think outside the box to a certain extent in terms of what hasn't happened before that might. But there's a lot of this to be learned from previous events, experience of other people, and quite often in carrying out an emergency plan, actually talking to the public bodies, the emergency services, the local authorities, those responsible for the enforcement licensing and all that sort of thing, can be very useful because they will have a wider body of experience and therefore may be able to envisage something that isn't in the experience of the person organising the event or the safety officer. So you do have to look at everything that could potentially go wrong, not only actually during the event itself, but in the run-up to the event. So if as we've just had overnight, some extremely high winds across the country, and that brings trees down, disrupts travel, then that may well actually affect the event before people even arrive. And at that point, you have to look at communication and delaying the event or controlling the way in which people then get to the event to make sure that it doesn't then cause problems outside of the venue or the site, which are going to cause other safety issues. It is unfortunately the case now that during any event, you have to look at terrorism, crime and disorder, and public disorder as part of the planning process. And in planning a large event, as I say, you will be able to lean on the emergency services for some key information and some pointers. There is quite a body of information out there, but a lot of it will hinge on your security arrangements, how you control people. So it can be easier to handle some of these things at ticketed events rather than at events where people just turn up and pay on the day and there's less control. And you will then, if you're organizing a large event, have to decide whether you are going to try and secure your event at the perimeter of your site or at the perimeter of the activity that's going on. So for instance, we've just gone through the sort of festival season, and the question there with those would be, do you provide your security cordon, if you like, around the campsites and the actual activities themselves, and then anybody going into those campsites and the activity goes through a security check, or do you provide the barrier between the campsite and the activity? And from an organizer's point of view, it might depend who's actually doing which and whether the campsites are under your control. But obviously from a potential risk point of view, there is probably equally as much risk in the campsite where people are around and surrounding your activity as there is within your activity itself. And an important consideration is if you've got a large event going on at a venue, it is worth, again, at the very early stages, talking to the emergency services, but talking to the communication links. Because if you're running a large event, which includes a large throughput of people through the nearby railway station or bus depot or whatever, then that railway station and that bus depot become a higher level of risk than they would perhaps ordinarily be. So it needs a degree of thinking wider than perhaps just the insulated event that you're running. As I say, one of the key issues in terms of trying to sort some of these things will be security, and it will possibly be that the whole site has to be secure for a set period of time. So you might subcontract out the security lock, stock and barrel, but again, there needs to be a good communication and a clear identification of who's actually in control. There are other crime related issues in terms of, if you've got concessions and ancillary activities going on collecting cash, then there needs to be secure arrangements for that to prevent potential risks. Subcontractors, if you're getting subcontract security, you need to have records of the qualification, the training of all the security staff, and obviously for all staff and stewards on an event, it's important to provide a briefing and an induction before the event actually gets underway so that everybody understands their role, their reporting lines, and what they need to do in the event of an emergency. In terms of stewarding, the event organizer is the one who's responsible for ensuring that there are a suitable number of competent stewards trained correctly on site. Stewards generally at events are responsible for public control, direction of people and traffic on the site, but outside the site, that's beyond their remit. So it's a good idea to have a level of stewarding so that individual stewards report to somebody who oversees a group of them who then reports up the line, so that when something happens, there's a clear communication line back to the person in control. At large events, stewards need to be briefed on crowd control, emergency procedures, the whole site, to understand what's going on so that they, if anything does go wrong, there are enough stewards to make sure we can get people away who are clearly identified to the public so that they know that they should be following their instruction, and those stewards are competent enough to actually get people to a place of safety. And that again requires a degree of information about knowing where the particular eventuality is if something's gone wrong. So a lot of what we will end up doing at that point is to look at crowd control. So we have to have an understanding of how crowds move around buildings and venues and outdoor events, and we have to therefore make sure that we understand what will cause people to move in a particular situation, how people will react, take on board the normal sort of behavior that in any eventuality people's first priority will be to find their friends, leave the building, usually they're looking to leave by the way they came in, to get somewhere familiar. If this is an event that has associated parking or camping, then people will be looking to get to those areas and move away from those rather than get totally away from the area immediately. And there needs to be a liaison with local services to make sure that if people, once people get out of the venue or the site, we can actually get them effectively away from the building. We also have to consider within the venue to look at crushing and trampling, so looking at stewarding and barriers to prevent people overloading certain areas. And again, simple things like on temporary stands and seating, to look at dynamic loading when people all start to move in unison. Something as simple as a wet Mexican wave can put a significantly different loading on the structure supporting people. So we have a whole load of issues that we have to consider when we're looking at things like crime and disorder. Wherever you get a large number of people, there's always a risk of crime and disorder, and particularly at events where it might be a musical festival or any sort of event where people are there to enjoy themselves, people tend to relax a bit more, and that makes the event an attractive target for crime. So organisers need to look at that, understand how they're going to do that, monitor what's going on, and work very closely with the police in looking at prevention and detection of crime as we move through the event. As I've said, we do have to unfortunately consider potential terrorism at events. Now, that may well be that it is a terrorist group, and in organising an event, you'll have to consider what sort of target you are presenting. Increasingly, we're aware that lone wolves can strike from a terrorist point of view, but they may well strike with any particular axe to grind. So if you have a particular type of event that may alienate part of the community, you may find that you get people with a particular fixation or a particular political leaning who might actually look to impact on your event to promote their own cause. And then you will get the odd individual who is just there to raise their own profile or their own particular odd issue, which may not be fundamentally terrorist labeled, but may have the same knock-on effect. So a lot of this is to look at the level of threat, the potential issue there, and then to look at what measures you put in place. But it is unfortunate now that every event has to consider itself a potential target. So in terms of your general risk management for the event, it is a review and cycling process. You identify all of the threats, establish what you're going to protect, look at any vulnerabilities that are still left, look at what risk reduction measures you can put in place, put in a plan to improve the security, and then review, reverse, and revise, and keep going around there until you're absolutely happy that things are going to be okay or as secure as you can possibly make them. The only problem with risk management is it's not simply enough to do a paper exercise. It's got to follow through into the implementation on site and the actual running of the event. And then before the event actually starts, there's some straightforward checks to run through from a practical point of view, checking your exits are clear, your communication systems are working, make sure there's, as you do a final inspection before the event runs, that there are no additional risks that haven't been taken care of, that you've got all of the staff, whether they're volunteers, stewards, security staff, you've got all the staff in place that you were expecting to have in, that all of the facilities are there, and therefore you do all of that, you do your final brief to all your personnel before you admit any of the public and take any risk with endangering people. Right, that is pretty much it for this morning's webinar. I haven't had any questions come through so far. If you have any questions, please type them into the screen now. Katie, have you seen anything else that I've missed?
No, to be honest, Kevin, I haven't. Oh, hang on.
Okay. Obviously, when checking your communications for an event, it's important you don't get feedback from another speaker or where you've been listening into the event on another machine.
Yeah, that's what happens when you leave your audio up on your other laptop. Sorry about that for everyone that just got a horrible awakening and for all the dogs that are probably barking in the local neighbourhoods. Yeah, I mean, there's no questions that have come in, and so I think if we just give this couple of moments, just if anybody has got any questions, just to type them in as of now.
Yeah, I would say type them in if you want to. One thing I would stress, because obviously event safety is a fairly key issue. There are guidance documents published by the government, but I would particularly point people to the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office. As I say, there's a range of documentation available to download to give you advice on your local events, and it is worth reading through that, because a lot of the things you put in place to deal with terrorism will also deal with a lot of your other security and potential crime and disorder issues as well. Okay, it doesn't actually look as if we're going to get very many questions, so I'd like to thank you for joining me today, and I would just point out, as you leave today, you will get an exit questionnaire on the webinar. We are asking a couple of particular questions. Firstly, are there any future subjects that you'd like us to cover in these webinars? And then secondly, we're also asking you, actually, do you feel you've got an area of expertise that you could share with everybody via one of our webinars? And if so, get in touch with us and we'll try and make sure that happens. But now I'm going to pass over to Katie to wrap up.
Okay, well, thank you, Kevin, and thank you for your time this morning. And again, thank you to everybody for joining us for our webinar today, which our webinars are going from strength to strength. They're proving very successful. So on that note, if I just highlight the next webinar that we've got coming up is on the 11th of October, the usual deal, 8 o'clock Wednesday morning. And we're looking at testing for compliance. So that's the next one. So feel free to register via our website for that. And then moving on into the autumn season, we've got the 15th of November, where we're looking at accessibility in commercial buildings. And then on the 13th of December, we're looking at the natural environment and how that can potentially be a barrier to development. So they are our next webinars for the rest of the year. So again, feel free to register and we look forward to seeing you online. Thank you for your time.
Katie,
oh, hello.
Sorry, Katie, just before you go, it did just occur to me in you trailing the future webinars. The next webinar is about testing for compliance. If you have any concerns about testing and how that's done in relation to regulatory control, and you've got questions prior to the webinar, if you email them through to us before the event, then we'll obviously try and make sure that we cover them off during the content of the webinar.
Absolutely. Just either feel free to send them over to Kevin or myself and we'll pick those questions up. Brilliant. Okay, so again, thank you for your time and we will see you soon.